Good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to everybody in our CCL community, especially our guests. Thank you for joining the discussion tonight. Our agenda tonight will start with a couple of short introductions before we will hear from Luke Bowler, Chief External Affairs Officer for ClearPath, with us to discuss ClearPath action. We reached out to Luke, who was gracious enough to fit us into a very packed schedule for ClearPath. There's strong interest in this event, and there's other climate events too, which the ClearPath team is at. So we want to thank Luke for joining us. Now I would like to have Craig Preston with CCL's Conservative Caucus just give a bit of an overview of the caucus and some of the other relationships which CCL has. So Craig?
Okay, thank you, Greg. Craig Preston out here in California, but I'm the chair of the Conservative Caucus for All Citizens Climate Lobby and glad to serve in that role as a volunteer with many of you. I just want to make a few comments here about the history of CCL in general and of CCL's Conservative Caucus. That we came together in 2007 when Marshall Saunders, our founder, started this, but around 2013 we realized if we only grow our left wing, we fly in circles. And we started recruiting conservatives to come in. And so I joined around that time and was glad to join the Conservative Caucus as it was forming and glad to be part of it. We started doing things like after the lobby meetings in DC, we would go meet with business groups and associations around DC that would take more of a conservative stance on solving climate change, something like ClearPath. And so we were thrilled to meet with a lot of different those groups and then start to collaborate and even go to a lot of their events. One of my favorite was Young Americans for Liberty. Lots of energy, young people fired up to make our country better. And they invited us to a lot of their regional conferences where we could then show that there are conservative solutions to these risks that we have with climate change. So we've grown and grown and grown. We have now over 1,000 people on our email list, and we're the largest action team within CCL and continuing to grow. Our focus is on giving that voice to the conservative side of this solution. One of our highlights was having an actual conservative leadership conference in Washington, D.C., so that we could all come together, go on Capitol Hill and lobby. And what a thrill to actually, it's always a thrill to go on Capitol Hill and lobby, but to go with a team of conservatives and go to a conservative member of Congress and see the feeling in the room be so welcoming because we didn't have to necessarily feel like we're at odds over the political spectrum.
Thank you, Preston. Yeah. So with that, Luke, you have our interest and attention.
Greg, thank you. And thanks, Mindy, and all of you at the Citizens Climate Lobby. Really happy to be joining you all. I thought maybe first I could tell you a little bit about ClearPath and ClearPath action, and then get into some of the policies that we're intimately working on and that we're going to start to see a little more of probably post-election, but a lot of that's getting teed up now as we speak. So ClearPath, similar to Craig's story, we were founded probably right after y'all in 2014. Greg mentioned our founder, Jay Faison, who was a business guy in Charlotte, North Carolina, didn't work in the energy field. He was actually an audio-visual company called Snap AV. And he had the good fortune of selling it to private equity. I think it's, a lot of small business dreams of that. And so he did really well financially with that. He was a lifelong Republican, but also deeply concerned and cared about climate change and saw a big gap in the party. And so he started to think about what he could do in terms of solutions. And so he founded ClearPath, started with a management consulting person who Greg also mentioned is now our CEO. He came from McKinsey and kind of helped create what ClearPath could look like. And what that is now is essentially we're a DC-based nonprofit. Primarily, we're a think tank out of ClearPath. So we come up with policy ideas, policy concepts, do a lot of think tank type things, research papers, et cetera. And then where I spend a lot of my time is ClearPath Action, which is our 501c4, where we can do the direct advocacy. We also have registered lobbyists who are able to go in and lobby Capitol Hill. And we focus on climate policies and clean energy policies. So we've primarily and historically been focused in the power sector. And we like to say we focus on baseload clean energy. So that's been nuclear power, fossil energy with carbon capture, renewables like geothermal and hydropower, and grid scale long duration battery storage. Our portfolio hasn't included wind and solar, not because we don't like it or support it, we do. There was just a lot of advocacy already around that. And so we thought we could be a little more effective in some of those other technologies that didn't have as vocal and well-financed and resourced advocacy support already that some of the wind and solar groups did. So we've also taken on a little bit of industrial policy. So when I say that, think petrochemicals, ethanol plants, steel, cement and concrete, and how do those industries decarbonize? The trajectory for the energy sector with carbon dioxide emissions is going down pretty significantly over the last 15, 20 years, where the industrial sector, carbon dioxide emissions is going up. It's actually now the largest sector. A lot of folks might think transportation or energy or ag would be the biggest. It's now technically the industrial sector with the largest emissions. And so what are the policies that can help drive innovations in the industrial sectors that will help ultimately bring down carbon dioxide emissions? So I came to ClearPath about 3 years ago. I spent a little over a decade on Capitol Hill in my early part of my career. Started with Senator Chuck Grassley. I'm an Iowa native, Marshalltown, Iowa, if any Iowa folks are on the call. Worked in Senator Grassley's office for about 3 years, doing mostly press and communications. And then after my time in Congress, I went and did private sector consulting for a large global public relations firm called Edelman, and worked in the energy and environment practice for them. Had a lot of private sector, ranging from some clean tech companies to some oil and gas companies. And one of the biggest companies, that wasn't a company, it was an account. One of the biggest accounts I worked on was the Department of Energy. So I was in the building there daily, helping them navigate some of their challenges. And then I was actually kind of pitching ClearPath for business development side of things, and turned out that they ended up hiring me 3 years ago. And so I've been helping ClearPath build. We're very DC centric, but kind of building our profile a little bit more outside of the Beltway and in the Beltway. And so we do a lot of strategic communications work. And really what we do a lot of is help Republicans get better messaging on climate policies. So we've done a lot of polling over the years. We do dial testing and focus groups. Most recently, we did a big project with Frank Luntz. Probably have seen him or heard him. And what we did with Frank was around what the task force rolled out. So we actually worked with the task force that Craig mentioned on messaging it. So we went in behind the scenes and tested with focus groups. How do conservatives think about this, care about this, and then turned that into some of how the task force is now able to message on that. So that's been a really fun project to work on. I think tonight this is a perfect time to have this conversation because literally this Friday, leader Kevin McCarthy is going to roll out what's called the Commitment to America. And this House Energy, Climate, and Conservation Task Force is one of several task forces. So they had groups working on healthcare policy, immigration policy, national security policy, tax policy. But we were intimately involved with the Energy, Climate, and Conservation Task Force, which just by the name alone is incredible. from where we've come as a party. It has climate in a big pillar of what House Republicans are going to do. It's not just the energy task force, it's the energy, climate, and conservation task force, which is remarkable. And that's literally a testament to groups like you all and you individually to really bring forward how important this is, not just for the planet and the country, but for us as conservatives too. So kudos to you all and others to really kind of change the dynamic of how Republicans are just now more comfortable talking about climate change. So I was thinking maybe what I could do is just give you a high level view of what the policies are going to look like in that framework. And then I'd love to just have a conversation and kind of open it up to questions and whichever direction you guys would like to take it. So there were 6 pillars. They called them pillars. It's sort of funny. Some of them and some of us had no idea, but we were working with the Evangelical Environmental Evangelical Network, EEN, and they reminded us that the 6 pillars was not such a good thing, and so we tried to get them to call them 6 points instead of pillars. Neither here nor there. But the six areas of policy are unlocking American resources. So that's bread and butter, Republican, traditional fossil energy. We need more of it, but it's beyond that, right? It's talking more about things like critical minerals and other technologies that we need to have access to. Letting America build, and that's really a nice way of saying modernizing permitting. We can talk about all of the policies that have led to where we are today that we can finance and authorize and provide tax incentives for clean energy technology. But right now it's going to be really hard and take too long to build any of that stuff because it's incredibly difficult to get a permit for any project. That's true for wind, that's true for solar, it's true for a transmission line, that's definitely true for pipelines. So sort of a modernized permitting agenda is the second pillar. The third pillar is on innovation, American innovation. So you'll see a lot of policies around increasing research and development, both for the Department of Energy, but the National Lab Complex. There's a wonderful national lab in Ames, Iowa. I think that's the only one in your region. But the national labs do some incredible work on bringing together a lot of the world's brightest minds and scientists and sort of what technologies we can do. A lot of the grid scale battery technologies are coming out of the labs. Next generation nuclear energy are coming out of the labs. And so what are those next generation of technologies? So American innovation is the third pillar. The fourth one, they call it beat China and Russia. So that's what it sounds like. That's sort of an American competitiveness policy. And more specifically, what that means is it's sort of twofold. It's trade policy. You'll see some trade policies that will encourage manufacturing and other industries to reshore back in the United States. And the message there is pretty clear. That's good climate policy because American environmental standards are the strictest in the world. So if we're able to bring some of this manufacturing back to the US, obviously it's good for a lot of reasons, including all of the jobs in y'all's communities, but it's actually very good climate policy because making anything here in the US is naturally going to be cleaner than making it in somewhere like China. And then the other 2 pillars, ClearPath doesn't work on as closely, but also very, very important. One being the conservation. So you've probably heard some Republicans talk about trillion trees. That's one of the policies out there. There's some other conservation forestry type policies. And then the 6th and final policy pillar is building resilient communities. So that will be disaster mitigation policies, some adaptation things, but primarily more around like flood protection and building resilient communities. So those 6 pillars were being introduced starting in June, the task force that Representatives Feenstra, Dusty Johnson, and Pete Stauber are all part of, they've been having sort of not super public events to roll these out. They've been doing more like stakeholder engagement type events, but they're all out there, they're all public. And then this task force, the Energy, Climate, and Conservation Task Force, will now, as of this coming Friday, 2 days from now, be packaged together with the whole House Republican agenda. And the reason they're doing that is obvious, that there's a strong likeliness they're going to take back the majority. And so as they're going into the meat of the election cycle, they can say, vote for us, here's what we're for. And not just that we think that this administration's policies are bad or what Speaker Pelosi is doing is bad, but we actually have something that we're for, which is why we are just so excited that something that they're for as House Republicans includes climate policy. So with that, I would love to take any questions and have a conversation about the task force or anything else that's going on in Washington, D.C. I know there was this Inflation Reduction Act that passed not too long ago. There's this permitting bill that Senator Manchin had as part of a deal to that got pulled out and might be in a continuing resolution. So those are things that we've been fairly involved in at ClearPath as well. So any of those topics I think would be great to talk about, or anything else for that matter.
Wonderful. And thank you, Luke. You've given us a lot to think about. And so I'm going to call on some people who have submitted questions.
And I'd be curious, you guys kind of help plow the ground and put some, seeds in for that. How did the announcement of the Conservative Caucus by Curtis fit into that plan?
So that's a really good question. So if you're not familiar with that, Representative John Curtis from Utah really kind of mastermind. There was not a caucus just to talk about climate policy. There had been some bipartisan caucuses over the years, which had a little bit of success, not much. So John Curtis, he's I think a sophomore member out of Utah, said we need a climate caucus, and so he took it upon himself, had a summit out in Utah, got a bunch of people excited about this, and launched a caucus. It now has 73 members, 73 Republican members signed up to join the Conservative Climate Caucus, which is outstanding. A caucus is primarily it's educational. So what they do is they host briefings, they convene people from industry and other NGOs to talk about things and come up with ideas, but it's primarily educational. The task force was tasked with coming up with specific policies. They have a great working relationship. John Curtis is a member of the task force. I think every member of the task force is in the caucus. So they sort of serve two different purposes, but in our minds, equally as important. And one thing that Curtis is also doing, in addition to these educational opportunities, climate education, he and this organization called the Conservative Climate Foundation, which was set up to help support the caucus, will take a delegation to the COP. That's the UN International Climate Policy Panel annual convening, where a lot of the international ministers and heads of state go and talk about like what their countries are going to do on climate policy. Historically, that hasn't been a real popular place for Republicans to go. Last year, John Curtis and 3 other members went. This year, I think there'll be at least 6, if not more, where they can actually go and talk about, hey, we have solutions to this too, and it doesn't have to be this one size fits all or sort of this anti-fossil fuel rhetoric that you often hear from a lot of people in environmental communities.
not sure if you heard that with him breaking off, but he was asking, what advice do you have for working with conservative offices on climate? And then also, are there differences if you're working with a House representative compared to on the Senate side?
Yes, they're very different. I worked in both, so they're very different. I think, you know, one of the best pieces of advice that we try to give people is that when a Republican member does something good on the climate, call them, email them, tweet at them, thank them. They need to hear that. A lot of them feel like they're kind of on the edge of a cliff. I've actually heard members of Congress tell us that they feel like they're on the edge of a cliff when it comes to climate. You know, they think it's the right place and good for the party, but you know, not everyone in the party agrees. And so for them to hear from constituents is really important. And you know, you as one and your partner two, but like if you get a handful of people calling into an office, it actually means more than you know. You know, my first job was in Senator Grassley's mailroom. So I read every piece that came in and like got it out to the right staffers that were going to correspond. But the positive stuff means so much, because most of what you get in a congressional office is like, we're so mad at you for this, or why are you so terrible? And that comes in all the time. And so the positive stuff means a lot. So that would be my most simple piece of advice. I do think they rely on folks like you all for education. They're not just doing energy and climate policy, they're doing everything else. And you know, their staffs are small bandwidths as well. They're doing everything else. And so when you can give them some constructive pieces of education, that goes a long way. Now that piece I would say is more important for House members. They're smaller staff. An average member of Congress's DC office might be like 8 or 10 people, and in a Senate office probably have 25, 30. So you have more like individual specialized staff members in the Senate. So that the education is really, really important in the House. So keep that in mind. If there's something that you can, you know, get to them and to their staffs, they actually do appreciate that. I guess one of the main differences is, you know, being statewide. Well, I guess it's maybe not as true for Dusty Johnson in South Dakota, but when you're a senator and you have statewide, it's tough to get around and be in every community and all the different media markets. And so the more you can kind of help them in your communities, like that's also really appreciative. Whereas a House member, they're just there more because it's less ground to cover. And so when you can be, you know, singing their praises, you know, thanking them for the work they do on climate, but also sharing it with other people, that goes a long ways as well.
Good. Well, Luke, thank you for reinforcing the need for our monthly calling campaign, as we call it within CCL.
Yeah, that's great that you guys do that. That's
and
awesome.
For the letter to the editors too in the local communities. We had a campaign in the state here where Katia and the team got letters published in every county in the state this past year.
They absolutely read those. They absolutely read those. Like every member of Congress has somebody in their office compile daily clips. So anywhere they're mentioned in any news report gets put into a packet or an email, and they'll read those. So that's great if you're doing letters to the editor. That's really important.
Good. So our next question is from Tim Connor.
Yeah, hi Luke. Hey, again, big word of thanks for showing up today and helping us understand what you're all about. I live in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. I am fairly active with education too. I'm part of an alumni group at MIT that does education using Climate Interactive's En-ROADS tool. And so that brings us to the question, can you share if carbon pricing was discussed as a potential solution by the task force?
It was. I know it was. And I think you had probably the members you know that are real supportive and would push for it. And then you have some of the members that weren't. Garrett Graves, who led the task force, he's, I think, pretty outspoken against a carbon price. that's kind of been his position. I couldn't tell you exactly why, but it was discussed. I don't know that it will be, well, I don't think it will be in the final package as a specific carbon price. I do understand there's a lot of interest around something like a carbon border adjustment, which I'm not sure where CCL is as a whole on that, or where you are, but I think some of the benefits could be similar in a mechanism like that. So you could see something like that in the final package. Tough one on that was that you didn't have some of the Democrats pushing for it in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was largely just a tax bill, right? It was reconciliation. And I kind of thought there was going to be some more support from some of the Democrats who have been out there supporting it. You didn't see it there either. So I'm not exactly sure vehicle-wise what would be next for that if it's not in what passed this year. And it doesn't seem like it would be part of this task force plan, which I should add, I didn't say this at the beginning, but sort of the reason for doing this whole task force policy agenda, that'll turn into legislation, like a comprehensive bill next year if they take the majority. So probably early in their package, each of these big comprehensive policy will be a like HR something, HR 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 would be my guess.
I'm going to call on Linda, who.
So maybe we can just dive a little deeper into how that border adjustment might be set up so that we have that sort of continued push. If we're saying we need to value the attribute of carbon intensity or lower carbon intensity, how do we continue to ratchet that lower so that we continue to make progress in globally in those emissions? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, I would not be the right person to give you the economic answer of how good it would work, but I can tell you some process. Kramer's terrific. We love Kramer. We had a meeting with him recently. You probably were involved, but I guess it was maybe 6 months ago. He and Sullivan from Alaska got together and put out a policy idea that had a lot of these types of concepts in it, which was really good to see. So they had support from a lot of different Republican members. I think Ted Cruz and John Kennedy and Capito were part of that. So those are all, some big name senators. There hasn't been anybody in the House who's really taken it on, to my knowledge. Maybe there is, they just haven't vocalized it very much yet, or we haven't met with them. But I think that would be a next step. I think, if you have those senators seemingly supporting it already, that's a good sign for if the Senate flips. But I think one of the things would be to get a champion for it in the House. And you all may know better than me if there is one already, but I'm not familiar of one.
But let me start with the one that I originally submitted, and that was, the task force proposals that you've laid out are we've heard pieces of that in different forums over the last few years. And, the R&D funding and the trees initiative is something, again, that we've heard before. But, is there anything in there that in your mind supercharges what we would call American innovation in a free market way, where you don't pick winners and losers? And then, do you have analysis that gets us to those emissions reductions that we're looking for? Because, the reason I'm such a fan of carbon fee and dividend, or just a carbon price, is that there's pretty strong analysis that, look, if you tax this stuff, then it will drive down emissions. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We sort of high level, we think of climate policy as more of a chronic condition rather than a one policy that will solve it forever. It will need constant maintenance and new policies and new ideas and concepts for years, decades. So that's sort of how we view it. So that's why we've at ClearPath have taken a real bullish stance on the innovation side, because it's the next generation of technologies that we think we need. And so yes, the R&D and the innovation policies up front would be really helpful to get those demonstrated. That has historically been a lot of early stage government support. I know as conservatives, we cringe sometimes as when we hear that, but the example we like to give is hydraulic fracturing. You know, maybe not the cleanest technology out there, but pretty clean and driving and led to a lot of emissions reductions in the United States. If you look at how the hydraulic fracturing, the Mitchell family in Texas had this idea to do horizontal drilling. They had this concept. They went to the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy funded a bunch of early stage research and development. There was a tax credit along with that. The technology scaled up in the 80s, 90s, and then early 2000s, you had the natural gas boom, largely because of that technology. So that kind of helping that commercialization scale up is a perfect case study of what we kind of like to see with the next generation of technologies. And so we've kind of taken more of like the tax incentive approach. We actually wrote a bill. It's been introduced by Senator Crapo in the Senate, ranking member of the Finance Committee, and Schweikert in Arizona in the House, among a few others that are co-sponsors. But it would be a tech neutral tax incentive. So it wouldn't, instead of the wind and solar PTC and ITCs and sort of each technology that gets their own tax credit, would be a tech neutral tax credit that technologies that produce power for the grid could claim that credit up to a certain level, and then it sunsets and phases out. Now, that's our area of expertise, has been in the power sector, and so that's kind of like the big policy that we have seen. Some of those incentives that would have been a part of that bill are part of the reconciliation package, and so I don't know what the appetite will be to do more tax policy around that will be. But we think, based on historical and some of the companies that we talk to, particularly in the oil gas, they're not going to necessarily do carbon capture, for example, unless there's a legitimate tax incentive for them to do it. So I don't know if that exactly answers your, there's probably some debate in the conservative circles of whether that's free market or not, but we've seen it work. And so that's been kind of our thing, is like, we need to scale up next generation of technologies. And the other thing that we often talk about and why we support that is this is a global challenge, and the rest of the world right now is growing a lot faster than ours, which means they're turning more power on and industrializing, which means they're going to be emitting a lot more than they are today. So will they choose clean energy, or will they choose the dirtier Chinese coal, the unmitigated old technologies that they're choosing today? They're going to go with what's cheapest. And so from our perspective, we want to make clean energy more affordable and make it here in the United States, and make it so affordable that the other countries who are rapidly growing choose American clean energy technology instead of something like an unmitigated Chinese coal facility. And so sort of that global view is something that we've always taken. And I think pricing here in the US, you're right, would definitely decarbonize our economy. It would not necessarily do anything in Southeast Asia or in the Middle East. A carbon border adjustment, if there's some type of a way to get some other countries and allies rally around that, then I think you have something that addresses a global solution. But I think from our perspective, we have always approached this as, what can we do that will actually support a global solution?
Is there a plan within the ClearPath effort to monitor emissions as we go and make adjustments in policies as necessary?
Great question, and that's something we are working on actively, and it's tough to do. It's combination of modeling and just analysis of how a technology and policy will work. But we're actually going to attempt. I say attempt because this is it's a hard thing to do with hypothetical policy, but attempt to put some type of like an emissions reductions in each of those pillars. So like, let's say you've got the American Innovation pillar, and you've got, I don't know how many bills will be part of that, but maybe there's 10 different ideas. Like, what would each of those lead to in terms of emissions reductions, and sort of put a number with each of those. It's gonna be a challenge, because some of the bills, we don't know exactly what bills are in there, other than like 3 or 4 or 5 of the examples that they've publicly said. But that is something that we definitely want to do. And
this is kind of a follow-on a little bit to the prior question. You may know that CCL advocates for a global emissions reductions of 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So the questions around that are: has ClearPath, in working with the task force, discussed those similar targets? Have you evaluated and measured this, and how you're going to measure the success of your approaches, which you touched on a little bit, and then how often do you think you might be updating those targets? Those are I think are key things that will help. If ultimately we need bipartisan conversations. I'm a volunteer with the Conservative Caucus, but we need everybody kind of rallying around it, and so I think it's important for people to be able to see the targets, or know what your targets are, and then be able to discuss them, in a bipartisan manner. So again, those are kind of targets we're advocating for, and we'd be interested to hear what you're shooting for.
Yeah, the answer is that most Republicans have been real reluctant to put targets on anything, and that's we've made some attempts at that. I don't know what the barrier is mentally, but they've been reluctant to put targets on it. Now, I will say that the one big exception, Linda, to your point, is the Kramer and Sullivan plan had a 40% global reduction target that they estimated their bill could get to 40% reduction, which it's not 50, but it's good. And it was also, to our knowledge, the first time Republicans really put an aggressive target out there publicly. So I think that there's some synergies happening with he and his staff on the task force. So I could see something like a 40% target in that task force plan. I would encourage you all to keep advocating for higher. I think it's important for them to hear that. But I would say that's probably might be as big a number as they'd go to. On the bipartisan front, absolutely. And I think that will be a challenge for them next year. I mean, everything's gotten so polarized, it's not going to get any better. But a lot of these policies that they're talking about have been bipartisan. It'll just be like, can they sell them and get them and pass them with a Biden administration? I mean, if they have the majority in the House, no problem. Senate could be a different story. But what can they actually make that's sustainable? And we say sustainable in terms of like politically sustainable, so that it's not something that whoever is the next president doesn't like it and can try to do some executive action to overturn policy. That would be bad, right? So we want stuff that can pass that will be sustainable long term. One quick thing to add, Larry, the one that you mentioned, net zero by 2050, that target has had more support, and I think the reason is that most publicly traded utilities in America have a business goal of net zero by 2050, and so they're pretty big political players in every state too, and they've already gone out with a big net zero by 2050 commitment. That makes it more politically palatable for Republicans.
Appreciate it.
Luke, thank you for this presentation. In terms of messaging, we've got people going out and tabling. You've mentioned some of them mentioned here. Can you speak to when reaching out to conservatives, what have you found are ways that you would encourage people? We have conservatives reaching out to conservatives, and we have liberals reaching out to conservatives. We call them friends of the caucus, and they come to our GOP events to help us table. And what would you do to help us in terms of our messaging?
Well, we have a bunch of resources we'd be happy to share. One, we do like that Frank Luntz focus group. Like I can share any of that. Some of it we've public on our various websites, our clearpath.org and clearpathaction.org. So that's available, and we can hone in on any of it that's helpful. I think that when you're talking to conservatives, and the reason why I'm saying this is because when we do our focus groups, we do like a Trump 16, Trump 20 voter, and then we'll do separate focus groups with somebody like a Trump 16, Biden 20 voter, like a traditional swing voter. We try to figure what works with both, because ultimately Republican members need to know, okay, I'm not going to upset my base conservative voter. Like that's, cardinal sin in politics. So they don't want to do that. But they're always, they need to and want to attract the moderate independents as well. And so what messages work with them? And what we've found are actually really aligned with how they're talking about these 6 pillars. So those are all message tested and work really well. So when you talk about like American competitiveness, that works incredibly well. Talk about American innovation, that works really well. Where it gets a little tricky, which is a little counterproductive for your organization and our organization, is the terms climate change. Depending on your member, they still get a little apprehensive. Can't put the psychological finger on that, but it's the case still. But when you just say climate or clean energy or lowering emissions, they're like, absolutely, we should totally do this. And the other thing we found that works, which is, it's kind of a no-brainer, but talking about what we all do anyway is the next generation and leaving our planet a better place. And that resonates what we found with conservative voters, but also the members of Congress too. And talking about their kids and grandkids, I think is, it sounds cheesy and simple, but it actually does kind of work. And that's true from, especially in the Frank Luntz research, it shows up a lot there.
Great, thank you.
And just a quick note as we get to our last question, on the ClearPath Action website, you can find a lot of this polling information, which you can drill down into the congressional district level from me kind of playing around with it. So a lot of this information is publicly available on the ClearPath Action site.
Yeah, we do a nationwide poll at least once a year, if not more. And then we'll model it down to the congressional district. And so like, how are some of the sentiment around climate or like the Paris Climate Accord or specific technologies. So that's all there at clearpathaction.org. I'll just caveat that those are models for the congressional district. We didn't poll test everything in every congressional district. So
understand,
the science is there, but it's a model, not an actual scientific tool in each district.
Luke, our final question of the night will be from Katia.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't want to make us go longer, but Luke, I want you to know there's been so many questions in the chat that we have not gotten to, which really highlights to me the value of what we're doing right now. And also just the courage that obviously you live with to deal with a very contentious issue across the aisle all the time. And I really kind of want to thank you for that. And just ask for, any listeners that are feeling apprehensive about changing the language. I mean, you've given us some hints about language that works. Do you have any, just final thoughts on how we all know it's a time of really difficult political discourse, and climate change is one of the most difficult of all. Just just sort of an open question, and I know we're out of time, so you may not be able to give us a lot of time.
I think it is important, and frankly, we're often jealous of CCL that you have such an amazing network around, and you can be doing the grassroots stuff, and we're just a DC focused group. So it's great to be able to partner with you all, and thank you all for what you all do. I do think it's important when you're talking to them is to lead with that the climate is changing and global industrial activities contributing to it. That outside of a handful of members is fine. And then I think it's we want to come up with the conservative solutions to this that are good for our economy, good for our jobs, and good for lowering global emissions. The other thing that we like to stress is that we want to take away the false choices in climate, that this should never be a Democrat versus Republican, or fossil versus renewables, or global emissions versus doing nothing at home. There's just a lot of false choices, and kind of like eliminating those false choices that we may not have the exact same solutions, but we want to work on something that's going to make a significant impact. And there's usually room for compromise. I mean, these are all high level thinkers in Congress, or at least most of them. So they do want to come up with solutions and find consensus. So I think just reminding them that there are conservatives that care about this stuff and are working on this stuff is just, it's awesome that you guys do that. So thank you.
Good. And Luke, I will say wow for everybody here. I feel like there's candor and perspective. And so thank you for sharing that with us tonight. I will just remind the CCL team that you can subscribe to a weekly newsletter, right, Luke, about ClearPath Action called The Rundown. And then also on Twitter, you can follow ClearPath Action as well, too, to get updates. For example, the CEO, Rich Powell, just provided testimony to the Ways and Means Committee, for example, where he elaborated on those false choices Luke was just referencing here.
So we also have our research directors testifying tomorrow at the Senate Energy Committee on critical minerals and technologies beyond lithium-ion batteries for grid scale storage. So if anybody wants to nerd out at, I think it's 10 a.m. on one of the C-SPANs or the Senate Energy website, our research director will be testifying.
Well, that is certainly of high importance to Representative Stauber, and we have several people from his district here who try to follow those events. So we will try to find that. So Luke, I know it's later on the East Coast. We appreciate your time here. And again, your candor. I feel like I was at the insider's table listening to you talk and share your perspective. So thank you so much.
All right, thank
and
you.
With that,
y'all have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luke.
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks
Luke.
so much.
Thanks.